The morning Augusta Finley walked into the Territorial Land Office in Calico Flats, New Mexico, carrying a leather satchel, a 5-year-old on her hip, and a fire in her dark eyes that could have scorched the desert floor clean through. Every man in that room went perfectly, breathlessly still. It was the spring of 1882, and the dust of the open range still settled on everything in town like a second skin. The land office smelled of pine resin and old paper, and a ceiling fan turned lazily overhead doing nothing useful for the heat. Behind the long oak counter stood a clerk named Purvis Dodd, who had worked in that office for 11 years and had never once, not a single solitary time, had a woman walk in unaccompanied to file a grazing rights claim. Augusta set her boy, Thomas, on the bench beside the door with a look that communicated clearly that he was to stay put and be quiet. He was a good boy, solemn in the way that children who have seen their father buried tend to become solemn too early, and he folded his small hands in his lap and watched his mother with wide brown eyes. She walked to the counter. "I am here to file a grazing rights claim on the lower Mesquite Flats," she said. Her voice was clear and measured, the kind of voice that had been schooled into steadiness through hard practice and harder years. Section 14, west of the Cimarron Creek tributary, 240 acres. Purvis Dodd blinked at her. He was a narrow man with spectacles that rode low on his nose, and he had a habit of peering over them when something puzzled him, which it appeared Augusta Finley was doing. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "that land is in contested territory." "I am aware of that," Augusta said. She reached into her satchel and produced a folded document, then another, then a third. She laid them on the counter with a precision that suggested she had practiced the movement. "My late husband, Robert Finley, held a provisional grazing permit on that section beginning in 1878. He died 14 months ago. Under territorial law, Article 12, Section 3, a surviving spouse may convert a provisional permit into a formal grazing rights claim within 2 years of the permit holder's death. I am within that window. These are my husband's death certificate, the original permit documentation, and my formal petition." Dodd stared at the papers. He picked one up, put it down, picked up another. "Mrs. Finley," he said, lowering his voice as if what he was about to say was confidential, though the 2 other clerks in the room were clearly listening. "That section is also claimed by Harlan Voss. Mr. Voss holds a current operating lease on the acreage adjacent, and he has been using the Mesquite Flats as part of his grazing rotation for 2 seasons now." Augusta did not blink. "Mr. Voss's adjacent lease does not give him legal rights to Section 14. My husband's provisional permit does. Which is why I am here to formalize it before the 2-year window closes. That window closes in 6 weeks, Mr. Dodd. I would appreciate your help in processing this claim." There was a long silence in the office. The ceiling fan turned. Somewhere outside, a horse shook its head and the bit jingled. "I will need to submit this to the district supervisor," Dodd said finally. "Given the contested nature, it may take some time." "How much time?" Augusta asked. "Several weeks, possibly." "Then I suggest you begin today," she said, and she said it pleasantly enough, but her jaw was set in a way that made Dodd straighten his spectacles and reach for his stamp. Augusta Finley collected her son from the bench, thanked the clerk in a tone that was equal parts gracious and iron, and walked back out into the blinding white light of the Calico Flats morning. She stood on the plank sidewalk for a moment, one hand shading her eyes, and let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for some time. Thomas tugged at her sleeve. "Did we get it, Mama?" "Not yet, my love," she said, "but we started." They walked back down the main street of town toward the livery where she had left their wagon. The street was busy with the ordinary commerce of a frontier town in full spring swing. Freighters rolling through, ranch hands loading supplies at the dry goods store, a pair of vaqueros crossing toward the cantina on the far end. Augusta kept her eyes forward and her chin level, which was how she moved through most spaces these days. Robert's death had stripped away the buffer between her and the world, and what remained was a woman who had learned to take up exactly the space she needed, and not 1 inch more, because every inch cost something. She did not hear the conversation that erupted behind her in the land office the moment she left. She did not hear Dodd's fellow clerk, a heavy-set man named Rupert, mutter that somebody ought to tell Harlan Voss about this before the week was out. She did not hear Dodd himself say, uncomfortably, that she had her paperwork in order and there was not much he could do about it. She did not hear Rupert say that, paperwork or not, Voss wasn't going to stand for a widow woman staking a claim on grazing land he considered already his. But she would feel the consequences of that conversation soon enough. Harlan Voss owned, in various combinations of formal deeds, operating leases, and informal territorial arrangements that blurred the line between ownership and occupation, roughly half of the usable land within 40 miles of Calico Flats. He was not a man who had started with nothing and built an empire through sweat and shrewdness, the way the frontier mythology liked to tell it. He had started with his father's money, invested in land early, employed lawyers and lobbyists in Santa Fe who kept territorial land laws drafted in ways that favored men like him, and pressed every legal and extra-legal advantage he could find. He was not, technically speaking, a criminal. He had never needed to be. The law, for most of his life, had been comfortable enough with men like Harlan Voss. He was informed of Augusta's filing by Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, his lead man, a wiry, leather-faced enforcer named Deck Sutter, had ridden out to the Finley homestead. The Finley place sat 7 miles south of Calico Flats, on the kind of land that was beautiful in a stark and unforgiving way, red clay flats giving way to a shallow valley with cottonwood trees along the creek. A modest house of adobe and timber that Robert had spent 3 years building, a small barn, a chicken yard, and a kitchen garden that Augusta had coaxed into improbable productivity. She had 23 head of cattle, 5 horses, and the provisional grazing rights to Section 14, which was the only thing that stood between her operation and slow collapse. Without that grazing land, she could not run cattle through summer. Without cattle, she had no income. Without income, she could not pay the taxes on the homestead itself, and the homestead would be lost within 2 years. Robert had understood this when he was alive, which was why he had secured the permit, and Augusta understood it now, which was why she had driven the wagon into Calico Flats on a Tuesday morning and laid her papers on Dodd's counter like she was playing the only card she had, which she was. Deck Sutter arrived at her gate at mid-morning, when she was in the kitchen garden pulling weeds. She heard the horse and stood, brushing red clay from her knees, and shaded her eyes to look at him. She had never spoken to Deck Sutter directly, but she knew who he was. Everyone in the county knew who he was. "Mrs. Finley," he said from horseback, not dismounting, which was deliberate rudeness in the codes of that place and time. "Mr. Voss would like to speak with you about some paperwork you filed." "Mr. Voss is welcome to speak with me through the Territorial Land Office," Augusta said. "That is the appropriate venue for a contested claim. Mr. Voss would prefer something more neighborly." "I am sure he would." She looked up at him steadily. "Convey my respects to Mr. Voss and tell him I look forward to the land office's decision." Sutter looked at her for a long moment. His face was the kind of face that had been weathered into an expression of permanent mild contempt. "Mr. Voss is a patient man with his neighbors," he said. "Within reason." "Good day, Mr. Sutter," Augusta said, and turned back to her garden. She did not let herself shake until he was gone, and she did it out of sight behind the barn, with her hands braced against the rough timber wall and her eyes closed, breathing slowly until the trembling in her legs stopped. Then she went inside, made a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and thought about what came next. The question of what came next was complicated by the fact that Augusta Finley was operating largely alone. Her nearest neighbor was a homesteader named Ezra Polk, 3 miles east, a decent man with 6 children and a wife, and barely enough margin in his own operation to keep his own family fed. He would help her if she asked, but she would not ask, because asking would mean drawing him into something that could cost him dearly. She had a younger sister in Kansas who sent letters and occasional packages, but who was too far and too settled in her own life to be of practical use. She had the lawyer in Santa Fe who had helped her understand her rights under territorial law, a young man named Harris Beaumont who had charged her half his usual rate because, as he put it, what she was doing was worth helping, but he was 130 miles away. What she had, in practical terms, in Calico Flats was very little, which was why the conversation she did not expect to have happened at the general store on Saturday morning. She had driven in to collect a supply order: flour, salt, lamp oil, a spool of wire for a fence repair. The store was run by a couple named Fletcher, Eliza and George, who were among the more genuinely kind people in town, and had been quietly helpful to Augusta in the months since Robert's death in small ways they would never have called charity. Eliza had left food on her porch twice in the winter, wrapped in cloth with no note attached. The store was moderately busy for a Saturday. Augusta was at the counter going through her list when the door opened behind her, and a man came in who made the other customers, for some reason she could not immediately identify, shift slightly in that subtle, unconscious way people shift when a notable presence enters a room. He was tall not in the theatrical sense of the word, but genuinely tall, the kind of tall that meant he had to be careful about door frames, and lean in the way that men who worked hard outdoors and didn't waste their energy went lean, with no extra softness anywhere. He was perhaps 32, 33, with a sun-darkened face and dark brown eyes that, when they moved across the room, moved with an unhurried attentiveness that Augusta found herself noticing against her will. He wore a working cowboy's clothes without any of the peacock ornamentation. Some of the younger hands affected plain canvas trousers, a dark blue shirt worn to the color of the sky near dusk, boots that had been mended more than once. His hat was ordinary. Everything about him was ordinary except for the quality of stillness he carried, which was not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of someone who had spent years in open country learning to read it. He went to the far counter where George Fletcher was sorting mail, collected a letter, thanked George by name, and then went still in a way that meant he had heard something. Augusta had not realized she was speaking until she noticed him listening. She was telling Eliza, in a voice pitched low but apparently not low enough, about Sutter's visit to her property and what it meant for the timeline of her claim. "He is going to challenge it formally," she was saying. "Voss has lawyers and I have Harris Beaumont and 130 miles between us. I need to know what my next step is before the district supervisor's review." Eliza Fletcher's face was creased with concern. "Augusta, that man does not play fair, you know that." "I know it," Augusta said, "which is why I filed paperwork instead of waiting for fair." The tall man at the far counter said nothing. He collected his letter and moved toward the door, and Augusta thought that was the end of it, that he had been listening only because the room was small and voices carry, and it meant nothing. Then he stopped. He turned around and looked at her directly, which was itself notable because most men in that town had a habit of addressing a widow woman approximately 2 inches to the left of her actual face, as if she were an impression of a person rather than the person herself. He addressed her eyes. "Excuse me for the interruption," he said. His voice was low and even. "Did you say you filed on Section 14 Mesquite Flats?" Augusta turned to face him fully. "I did." "Harlan Voss has been grazing that section for 2 seasons, he said. "Not because he holds rights to it, because nobody's been there to say he can't. You know he's going to fight this." "I do know that," Augusta said. "Were you planning to tell me something I don't know?" There was a fraction of a pause, and then something moved across his face that might have been amusement or respect or both. "I was going to tell you that the district supervisor, a man named Caldwell, has a practice of scheduling site reviews on contested claims before he makes his determination. If Voss gets to the site first and establishes improved use cattle on the ground, fencing, any kind of infrastructure, it can complicate your claim regardless of the paperwork. The territorial statute is clear on paper. Caldwell has a habit of interpreting it with some flexibility when Voss is involved. Augusta looked at him carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you filed the paperwork," he said simply. "And that took something." He nodded to her, nodded to Eliza, and walked out of the store. Eliza Fletcher watched the door close behind him and then looked at Augusta with an expression that combined several things at once. "That is Gideon Crawford," she said. "He runs cattle out of the old Peralta Grant land about 12 miles northeast. He has been having his own disagreements with Voss for 3 years. Augusta considered this. "He works for Voss." "He most certainly does not," Eliza said. "They are about as friendly as 2 scorpions in a boot." Augusta thought about what he had said for the rest of the drive home, and she thought about it that evening, while Thomas sat at the table doing his letters by lamplight. And she thought about it the next morning when she went out at dawn to check on her cattle, and stood in the pale, early light looking south toward the Mesquite Flats grazing land that she needed to hold. If Caldwell was going to make a site visit, and if Voss was going to make sure there was evidence of his use on the ground when Caldwell arrived, then she needed to get her own cattle onto that section and keep them there, which meant moving her herd 7 miles to land that she technically had rights to but had not yet formally occupied, before Voss could establish preemptive use. It was the right move. She understood that clearly. She also understood that moving 23 head of cattle by herself with no hired hands, across 7 miles of open territory that Voss's men considered their employers, was not a small undertaking. She sat on the fence rail in the early morning light and weighed her options with the precise, unsentimental accounting of a woman who had been making do for 14 months and who had stopped pretending there was help available that there wasn't. She could hire men from town, but she didn't have enough money to make it worth a cowhand's while to risk antagonizing Voss. She could ask Ezra Polk, but she had already made that resolution. She could do it alone. She was still sitting on the fence rail working through the logistics of doing it alone, which were considerable, when she heard a horse coming up the road from the north and looked up to see Gideon Crawford riding toward her gate. He stopped at the gate and looked at her. She looked back at him from the fence rail. "You have been thinking about what I said," he stated. "I have," she said. "And you are trying to work out how to move your herd onto Section 14 before Caldwell rides out to do his review." "I am." He dismounted, looped his reins over the gate post, and leaned against it with the ease of a man comfortable in outdoor spaces. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly than she had in the store. He had a straight nose and a jaw that suggested a person who held things in rather than let them out. And there was something around his eyes that spoke of patience worn into the bone through long use. He was, she noted despite herself, a genuinely handsome man. She filed that information in the category of things that were true but not currently relevant. "I can help you," he said. "I have 4 hands who ride for me. We can move your herd in a day. I know the best route that keeps us off Voss's patrol patterns." Augusta studied him. "Why would you do that?" "Because Voss has been expanding his territory by sitting on provisional permits and waiting for people to give up or die," he said. "Your husband had that permit. You have the legal right to that land." "I have my own reasons for wanting to see Voss's operation checked, but that aside, what you are doing is right and it deserves to succeed." "Your own reasons," Augusta said. "Which are?" He met her eyes. "Voss tried to push me off my northeast range 3 years ago. He was not successful, but he has not stopped trying. Every time someone stands up to him, it matters. Yours is the first formal filing anyone in this county has made against his land use in 4 years." Augusta was quiet for a moment. The morning was still around them, the chickens clucking softly in their yard, the distant sound of the creek. Thomas would be awake soon and wanting breakfast. "I do not take charity," she said. "If you help me move this herd, I want to pay you a fair day's wage for yourself and your men." Something shifted in his expression, not offense, something gentler than that. "That is fair," he said. "I cannot pay what Voss would pay," she said, "but I can pay honest." "Honest is what I charge," he said. They shook hands on it. His hand was very large and very calloused, and the handshake was firm and businesslike, which she respected. He told her he would bring his men on Wednesday, which gave them 5 days before what he estimated Caldwell's review timeline to be. She went inside and made Thomas his breakfast and did not examine the fact that, for the first time in quite a long time, the weight she carried when she woke up had shifted, if only slightly. Gideon Crawford rode back toward his own land, thinking about the particular quality of steadiness in Augusta Finley's eyes. He had met determined women before. The frontier had no shortage of them. It made them, the way a forge made steel, under pressure and heat. But there was something in her that was different from simple stubbornness or necessity-born grit. She had the paperwork. She had thought it through. She had walked into that land office and laid her documents on the counter and spoken the applicable law to a clerk who had never expected to hear it from a woman in a calico dress with a child on her hip. And she had done it without grandstanding, without theater, with the level professional confidence of someone who had prepared because preparation was what you did when you could not afford to fail. He found that remarkable. He found it, if he was being honest with himself, which he generally tried to be, more than remarkable. He had been in Calico Flats for 3 years, and in that time had built his operation from the remnants of the old Peralta Grant land into something solid, something his, something that had taken the entirety of his attention and all of his capability. He had not had time for much beyond the work. He had not made time, which was perhaps more accurate. There had been a woman in Tucson, briefly, 2 years back, but she had wanted a man who would be in one place, and Gideon at that time had still been in the process of becoming the man who could be in one place, and it had ended without great drama or great pain. He was 32 years old. He ran 800 acres, employed 4 good men, kept 1,500 head of cattle through the seasons, and had a house that he had built himself, and that was, he was aware, too large for one person. He was aware of all of this in the abstract, background way that a man is aware of things he is not quite ready to examine directly. He put Augusta Finley out of his active thoughts and spent the afternoon working with his foreman, a weathered Mexican-American cowhand named Alejandro Ruiz, who had ridden for him since the first season, and who was the most capable cattle handler he had ever worked with. He told Alejandro about the Wednesday drive, and Alejandro nodded thoughtfully and said he had heard about the widow Finley's filing, and he had heard what Sutter had done at her place, and he looked forward to helping. The other 3 hands, a young man from Missouri named Cal, a former vaquero named Santos, and a quiet Texan everyone called Dutch, were equally willing. This did not entirely surprise Gideon. Voss was not loved by working men. Tuesday evening, Gideon sat on his porch in the late light and wrote a letter to the district supervisor's office in Santa Fe, referencing the Finley claim on Section 14, and formally noting that the claimant had occupied and provisionally used the land through the permit held by her late husband, and that any site review should account for the legal history of that permit. He sealed it and addressed it and set it aside to mail in the morning. It was not much, but it put something on the record from an independent third party, and in land disputes, paper mattered. Wednesday morning, he and his 4 men rode down to the Finley place at 7 o'clock. Augusta was already up and working, which he supposed he should have expected. She had the cattle sorted out of the yard and into the south field ready to move, and she had her horse saddled and was wearing practical riding clothes, a divided skirt, heavy boots, a wide-brimmed hat that had clearly been her husband's and that sat with practiced familiarity on her head. She looked at his 5 men with a frank, evaluating gaze, then at him. "I appreciate you being on time," she said. "We will need to move by mid-morning to be on Section 14 before the day gets hot," he said. "The cattle will need water at the creek crossing." "I know the route," she said, which of course she did. Thomas appeared at the door of the house behind her, and a woman appeared behind Thomas, older, compact, with sharp eyes, who Augusta introduced as Mrs. Reyes, her neighbor's aunt, who had agreed to stay with Thomas while Augusta made the drive. "You are leaving the boy," Gideon observed. "He is 5, Augusta said, with an expression that suggested she thought this was sufficient explanation, which it was. They moved out. It was a long day, of the best kind of long day, the kind with clear purpose and the satisfaction of hard physical work done well. Gideon had spent enough years moving cattle to find a deep and specific pleasure in it. The rhythm of it, the way a good group of riders develops a wordless coordination, the way the animals respond to patient consistency. Augusta Finley rode with a confidence that said she had done this since childhood, which he later learned was true, as she had grown up on a homestead in Colorado and had been working cattle before she could multiply. She did not stay out of the way and let his men handle it. She rode flank, she called directions that were clear and useful. She made decisions about the pace and the route with an authoritative ease that Alejandro, riding beside Gideon at one point, noticed with visible approval. "She knows what she is doing," Alejandro said quietly. "She does," Gideon said. They moved the herd across the 7 miles, through the creek crossing where the cattle slowed and drank in the heat of late morning, and onto Section 14 by early afternoon. The Mesquite Flats were aptly named open rolling grassland bordered by mesquite scrub, good grazing land, with access to the Cimarron Creek tributary that would keep the cattle watered through summer. It was, Gideon thought, genuinely good range. Robert Finley had made a sound choice when he secured that permit. Augusta rode the perimeter of the section while his men spread the cattle across the grass, and he rode beside her and said nothing, understanding that she needed to look at it and know it. After a while she said, "Robert always said this was the piece that would make the difference." "He was right," Gideon said. She looked at the cattle grazing in the afternoon light, and something in her face did something complicated and then resolved itself back into composure. "He died of a fever," she said. "Not dramatically, not in some grand frontier fashion. He just got sick in January and did not get better. It was very ordinary and very final." "I am sorry," he said. He meant it without ornamentation. She looked at him. "You lost someone." "My father," he said, 2 years ago, back in Texas. I was not there when he went. That is a different kind of hard." She nodded once, acknowledging this. They rode back toward where his men were setting a temporary rope line to keep the herd on the section overnight. When the work was done and the light was going gold and flat in the west, Augusta paid each man what she had promised, counting coins from a small leather purse with a careful hand, and then she counted out Gideon's wage and held it out to him. He looked at it. "Take it," she said. "We agreed." "We did," he said, and took it. She looked at him then with a slight tilt to her head as if she was measuring something. "Why did you really come?" she said. "Not just today, the store, riding out to my place. You said your own reasons, but you could pursue your own reasons against Voss in a dozen other ways." He considered lying, or at least deflecting. He was a man who had spent years cultivating a certain comfortable distance between himself and full candor, not out of dishonesty, but out of a long habit of self-containment. But there was something about the directness of her, the same quality that had put her paperwork on Dodd's counter, the same quality that had sent Sutter away from her gate without a concession, that made deflection feel both dishonest and somehow unworthy. "Because when you walked out of that store," he said, "I thought you were the bravest person I had seen in a long time, and I meant that in the plainest possible way, and I thought the bravest thing deserved to succeed." She went very still. He held her gaze. "I am a widow with a 5-year-old and a marginal cattle operation and an active dispute with the most powerful man in the county," she said at last, not as a deflection, more as if she was reading him the terms of something. "I know what you are," he said quietly. There was a long moment in the cooling evening air with the smell of grass and cattle and mesquite, and then Augusta Finley looked away and a faint color had come into her face that she did not allow to stay long. "I should get back to Thomas," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He rode back to his own land in the settling dark, and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in some time, which was the specific kind of attentiveness that means a person is occupying your interior landscape without your having formally invited them. He let it be, because he was not a man who rushed toward things. The district supervisor's review was scheduled for 10 days hence, which Gideon learned from a letter Caldwell's office sent to him. Apparently his letter noting the claim history had prompted an official response. He relayed this to Augusta through a note carried by Santos, who was riding past the Finley place on other business, and her response was a single line: "I will be there with documentation." Of course she would. In those 10 days, events moved with the particular compressed inevitability that characterized contested land disputes in territorial New Mexico. Harlan Voss, who was 61 and corpulent, and who had the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime calculating odds and rarely been surprised, responded to Augusta's filing through his lawyer in Santa Fe, with a counterpetition arguing that the provisional permit held by Robert Finley had lapsed due to failure of use. A creative interpretation of the statute that Harris Beaumont, the young Santa Fe lawyer, immediately and forcefully challenged in a written response that cost Augusta another 3 weeks of egg money. Beaumont was good. More important, he was right, and the law was clear enough that even Caldwell was going to have difficulty ignoring it entirely. Gideon had made inquiries and learned that Caldwell, while certainly amenable to Voss's influence, was also a man who cared about the legality of his own position and would not risk formal censure for a grazing rights dispute, not with territorial statehood politics heating up and everyone in the administration being watched more closely. In other words, the law was on Augusta's side, but only if she could survive the pressure long enough for the law to do its work. The pressure was not subtle. On the Thursday before Caldwell's review, a section of fence on the Finley homestead was cut, and 6 of her cattle drifted off the property before she discovered it at dawn. She spent the better part of the morning tracking them down, with Thomas riding behind her on the older horse, the boy sitting straight-backed and silent, and helping spot the cattle in the scrub with the focused attention of a child who understood, even if imperfectly, that this was not a game. When she came back with the last 2 animals and found Gideon Crawford sitting on horseback at her gate, she stopped and looked at him for a moment. "Dutch saw the fence cut when he was riding the creek line this morning," he said. "He came and told me." "I have them all back," she said. "I see that." He paused. "This is going to get worse before Caldwell comes." "I know." "I want to leave Dutch at the Section 14 line until after the review," he said. "He is a good man and he is armed, and his presence there is a legal deterrent." Augusta considered this. "How much?" "No charge," he said. "This is me pursuing my own reasons." She looked at him for a long moment. "Gideon," she said, and his name in her mouth was the first time she had used it, "I am grateful for what you have done. I do not want to keep taking from you." "You are not taking," he said. "I am choosing to give." Another silence. The morning was already warm. "All right," she said. "Tell Dutch he is welcome." "Good." He shifted in the saddle. "There is also the matter of Caldwell. He will expect to speak with the claimant. You will need Harris Beaumont or someone with legal knowledge present. Beaumont cannot make the trip on this timeline," she said. "His last letter said he would try to send a written brief." "I know the territorial statutes well enough," Gideon said. "I had to learn them when Voss came after my Northeast range. I cannot appear as your legal representative, but I can stand there as a neighbor with knowledge and speak to the factual record if Caldwell invites comment." She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to learn, which was the look she wore when she was accounting for something she had not expected. "You are very thorough," she said. "I try to be," he said. He looked at her directly. "You are not alone in this, Augusta. You do not have to be alone in this." She held his gaze. There was something in her eyes that was not quite the armor she usually wore, something that cracked open slightly like a door moved by wind and then closed again. But he had seen it. "I will make coffee," she said. "Come in." He tied his horse and went in. The inside of the Finley house was neat and purposeful in the way of a person who lived with both limited resources and active pride. The furniture was plain but well made, the kind Robert had probably built himself. The kitchen was bright with a window above the sink that looked east toward the cottonwoods. On the table were Thomas's primer and a small drawing the boy had made in charcoal of what was either a horse or a dog. On the shelf above the hearth were a few books, a small clock, and a framed photograph of a man and a woman on what was clearly their wedding day. Gideon did not look at the photograph long. He sat at the table while Augusta made coffee and they talked about Caldwell and the review and the documents she would need to present. And Thomas came in from the yard with red clay-dirty hands and looked at Gideon with the direct, candid curiosity of a small child. "Are you the man who helped move our cows?" Thomas asked. "I am," Gideon said. "Alejandro let me sit on his horse," Thomas reported. "It was very tall." "Alejandro is generous," Gideon said seriously. Thomas considered this with the weight of a judge evaluating testimony and apparently found it satisfactory because he went and washed his hands without being asked, which Augusta noted with a small private smile. They talked for an hour, not only about the land business, about his operation to the northeast, about the cattle breed questions they both faced with the changing market, about the territory's politics and the railroad coming, and what it would mean for ranchers. She was sharply intelligent and had thought carefully about things that many people in her position had not yet needed to think about. He found himself not wanting the conversation to end, which was information. When he left, he did not say anything about the way he felt. It was too early. There was too much at stake in the immediate practical situation, and Gideon Crawford was a man who understood that timing was a form of respect. Caldwell's review was held on a Tuesday morning in mid-April. The district supervisor arrived with a deputy and a surveyor's assistant, and Harlan Voss arrived at almost the same moment with his lawyer and Deck Sutter, and two other hands who presumably were there for atmosphere. Augusta arrived with her documents in her satchel, wearing her best-dressed dark blue wool, fitted at the waist, which was not the sort of practical thing she usually wore, and with her chin precisely level. Gideon arrived with Alejandro, both of them presenting themselves simply as neighboring landowners with interest in the factual record. Voss looked at Gideon with the measured, cool hostility of a man who has filed it for future reference. Caldwell was a compact, graying man in a good suit who moved with the self-importance of a minor official who has learned that his minor position can be made to feel major. He examined the documents. He walked the section boundary with his surveyor's assistant. He spoke with Voss's lawyer at some length. Then he spoke with Augusta. He asked her about the original permit. She produced the documentation. He asked about her husband's use of the land in the years prior to his death. She had affidavits from Ezra Polk and another neighbor attesting to Robert's cattle on Section 14 in the seasons before his death. She produced those. He asked about her current use of the section. She directed his attention to the 23 head of cattle presently grazing on it, which was the kind of evidence that was difficult to argue with. Voss's lawyer made a spirited argument about lapsed provisional permits and the definition of continuous use. Harris Beaumont's written brief, which Augusta read portions of aloud in a clear, steady voice, made an equally spirited counterargument grounded in the actual language of Article 12. Gideon spoke twice, briefly, both times with the careful neutrality of a factual witness noting public record, the dates of Robert Finley's permit, the public knowledge of Voss's use of adjacent lands, the absence of any formal challenge to the permit prior to Augusta's conversion filing. Caldwell listened to all of it with the expression of a man who had been hoping this would be simpler. When Voss stood up and began a statement about his investment in this territory, and the importance of stable land management, and the inconvenience of disruptions to established operations, Caldwell actually pinched the bridge of his nose. It was in this moment, in the particular pause that followed Voss's statement, that Gideon looked at Augusta, who was sitting straight-backed on her chair with her documents in her lap and her hands still, and her face showing nothing except attention. He knew what it had taken to sit in that chair. He knew what she had done to be in that moment. He knew the months of work and grief and determination and narrow margin that had led to her laying those papers on that surveyor's table in the open air of Section 14, with 23 head of cattle grazing behind her as evidence. He thought she was extraordinary. He thought it with a fullness that he had been carefully not thinking in full for the past 10 days, and in that moment he let himself think it without qualification. Caldwell's decision came 3 days later by written notice. The grazing rights claim on Section 14, filed by Augusta Finley, widow and surviving heir to Robert James Finley's provisional permit, was approved and converted to a formal claim of record. Harlan Voss's counterpetition was denied. Augusta read the letter twice. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and put her head on her arms and cried, briefly and fully, in the way of someone who has been carrying something at a sustained high tension for a very long time and has now been permitted to set it down. Thomas found her and patted her back and asked if they had gotten it, and she lifted her head and looked at her son and said, "Yes, my love, we got it." She wrote to Gideon that afternoon. The decision came. "We won, thank you. Please come for supper on Friday if you are willing." He was willing. He arrived on Friday with a bottle of wine he had ordered from the merchant in Calico Flats 3 days prior on the private and unexplained assumption that there might be something to celebrate, which was either confidence or optimism, and he supposed it did not much matter which. Augusta had made a genuine supper, not the careful, modest meals she usually allowed herself, but an actual occasion-worthy meal, a roasted chicken with the vegetables from her kitchen garden and fresh cornbread and beans cooked with dried chilies. The table had a cloth on it. Thomas was in his good shirt. There was a small vase of early wildflowers in the center of the table that Thomas mentioned, with great seriousness. He had collected himself from the creek bank. It was the first real meal in a house with a family that Gideon had sat down to in a long time, and the particular warmth of it, the boy talking about his day, the lamplight, the sound of the evening outside the windows, Augusta moving between the stove and the table with the unhurried certainty of a person in her own domain, settled around him with a feeling he recognized as belonging. He talked with Thomas about cattle and horses, and whether mules were smarter than horses, which Thomas had strong opinions about. He helped clear the plates when supper was done, which was apparently not something Augusta had expected, because she looked at him with a slight surprised expression before accepting it. Thomas went to bed at the hour decreed for Thomas, which Augusta enforced with gentle firmness, and then they sat on the porch in the dark spring evening with cups of coffee and the wine open between them and the sound of the night all around. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Rebuild," she said. "This summer I can run the herd on Section 14 and actually have enough grass to bring them through to fall market weight. If I get a decent price, I can hire 2 hands for next season. 2 years from now, if everything goes as it should, I might actually be solvent." She said this with the satisfaction of someone who has seen the trajectory of a plan and found it sound. "That is a good plan," he said. "It is the only plan I have," she said, but she said it with humor. The night was soft, the way spring nights in New Mexico can be when the wind drops and the desert breathes quietly, and the stars were extraordinary the way they always were out here where there was no light to dim them. "You called me brave," she said after a while. She did not look at him when she said it, but her voice had something different in it. He was quiet a beat. "I did, in the store. You said what I had done took something, and then earlier the day of the review, I saw the way you looked at me." She paused. "I want to be honest with you because you have been honest with me. I do not know what I am in a position to." She stopped, started again. "Robert has only been gone 14 months. I am still learning who I am without him. I have Thomas and the land and this fight I just won, and I do not want to mismanage what you have offered me, Gideon, because you have been very good to me, and I do not want to handle that carelessly." He listened to all of this without interrupting. "I am not asking for anything quickly," he said. "I'm not asking for anything at all if we are being precise. I brought supper wine because there was something to celebrate. That is all that tonight is." She looked at him then. The lamplight from the window touched the side of her face. "But the other thing," she said, "the thing you are not asking for, is present," he said honestly. "But I have been patient before and I am good at it." She looked at him for a long time with an expression he was still learning to read and was not certain he ever entirely would. Then she nodded once slowly with a quality he could only interpret as decision. "Then let us be friends," she said, "properly, intentionally." "Yes," he said. And so they were. It was perhaps the most deliberately and consciously constructed friendship that either of them had ever undertaken, which was also a way of saying that both of them knew exactly what it was becoming while maintaining the useful fiction of its not yet having become it, because the useful fiction gave them room to move toward each other at a human pace. They had supper together twice more in May. He helped her with the fence repairs that the cut wire had made necessary. She brought food to his place one Saturday, a covered pot of something that smelled extraordinary, because she had heard from Alejandro, who had mentioned it to Dutch, who had mentioned it to Santos, who had apparently mentioned it to Eliza Fletcher at the store, that Gideon had had a bad week with a sick cow and a broken water pump, and had likely been eating whatever could be made fast. She denied that she had gone to these lengths of information gathering, and he very kindly did not press. He brought Thomas a leather-bound journal because the boy was interested in writing and drawing, and when Augusta asked where he had found a journal that nice in Calico Flats, he said he had ordered it from the merchant in Santa Fe, which was a 4-day mail round trip, which she understood perfectly well was a long way to go for something she had not asked for. "You are not being subtle," she told him. "I have not been subtle since the store," he agreed. She laughed, which was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, not the small private smile she allowed herself, but a genuine laugh, bright and unguarded, and the sound of it did something to his chest that he was absolutely certain he was not going to recover from, and he found he did not want to. In June, when the summer heat was coming down in full weight, and the cattle on Section 14 were doing well on the good grass, they rode out together on a Sunday to check on the herd, the way neighboring ranchers do, except that by this point no one in the county was pretending it was purely about the cattle. Eliza Fletcher had mentioned it to someone. Alejandro had mentioned it to someone. Even Thomas had apparently reported to Mrs. Reyes that the tall man had been to their house 4 times, which Mrs. Reyes had reported to approximately everyone she knew. They rode the fence line of Section 14, and the sky was immense and blue, and the grass was good, and the cattle were sleek, and Augusta looked at them with a satisfaction so deep it was almost visible, like light through cloth. "My father's brand," she said at one point, looking at the cattle. "Robert changed it when we married, added the F when Thomas takes it on. I want to add something that makes it his own, something that says this land, this place." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Gideon said. They had stopped their horses at the creek where the water moved shallow and bright over smooth stones. The cottonwoods were full green overhead and the light came through them in the particular shaking pattern that cottonwood light makes, restless and lovely. He looked at her. She was looking at the water. "Augusta," he said. She turned, and whatever she saw in his face made her go still. He did not have a speech prepared. He was not a man who trafficked in speeches. He said what was true in the plainest language he could find for it. "I think I have been in love with you since the general store," he said. "I know that is fast by some accounting, but I have spent my life being very certain about what is in front of me, and what is in front of me has been clear for some time now. You do not have to have an answer today. You do not have to have an answer soon. I wanted you to know it plainly because you deserve plainness." Augusta looked at him for what felt like a long time. In the cottonwood light her face was open in a way she rarely allowed, and the thing he saw there was not uncertainty. "I have been trying to be careful," she said slowly, "because careful felt like the right way to honor what I had before, But I think there is a difference between being careful and being afraid. And I do not want to be afraid. She held his gaze. I already know, Gideon. I have known for some time. I have just been working up to letting myself know it. He reached across the small space between their horses and took her hand. Her fingers closed around his. They stayed like that for a while, at the creek on Section 14, with the cottonwoods shaking their light over the water and the cattle grazing in the good summer grass behind them. And neither of them said anything more because nothing more was necessary. The courtship, such as it was conducted with an unhurried and genuine pleasure that neither of them had entirely expected. There was no artificiality in it because there was no pretense between them at this point. They had been through too much in too short a time for pretense to have any foothold. What they had instead was the discovery of each other in the incremental way that matters. The small revelations, the ordinary moments, the ways a person is most themselves when they are not performing. He learned that she read widely and thought about what she read and had opinions on territorial politics and the federal land policy that were better reasoned than most men he had met. She learned that he was genuinely funny in the quiet, dry way that catches you off guard and is better for being quiet. He learned that she sang under her breath when she was cooking, not always in tune, and never seemed to notice. She learned that he had a habit of fixing things he noticed were broken without saying anything about it, so that she would come out in the morning and find the barn door hinge repaired or a wagon wheel respoked without any mention. And when she thanked him, he would say he'd had a moment, and it was nothing. Thomas approved of Gideon with a seriousness that was both moving and slightly comic. He began reporting to Gideon on the status of various things at the homestead with the gravity of a small foreman. The south fence post was still leaning. The roan horse had been favoring her left foreleg. The chicken population had increased by 4 owing to a successful hatching. Gideon received these reports with equal gravity and discussed them with Thomas as professional matters of shared concern. Augusta watched this and felt something that was distinct from any other feeling she had, a very particular and quiet joy. In August, Voss made one more attempt. His lawyer filed a formal protest with the Territorial Attorney General's office in Santa Fe, challenging the land supervisor's decision and alleging procedural irregularities in Caldwell's review. It was a legal long shot and everyone involved knew it, but it created a period of uncertainty that lasted 6 weeks and cost Augusta sleep and cost her Harris Beaumont's continued services, which she could barely afford. Gideon, who was furious in the very quiet way that he was furious about things, which meant a stillness in his jaw and a precision in his movements and very few words about it, rode to Santa Fe himself and spent 3 days there. He met with the Attorney General's representative. He brought the documentary record. He spoke with 2 members of the territorial legislature who he had met in the course of his own land disputes with Voss and who were, by this point, thoroughly tired of Harlan Voss's practices. He came back dusty and tired and said only that the protest would not succeed. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because the Territorial Attorney General has his own ambitions and this is an election year, and Voss is not as untouchable as he used to be," he said. "And because the law is plain and the record is clean and sometimes, occasionally, those things are enough." He was right. The protest was dismissed in September. Harlan Voss, having exhausted his legal options and apparently calculated that the cost of continued pursuit exceeded the value of the section, did not pursue the matter further. He was not gracious about it. He would not be. But he was, in the end, outmaneuvered by a woman with proper paperwork and a support network he had underestimated, and the loss was noted and discussed in Calico Flats with quiet satisfaction by the significant number of people who were tired of Harlan Voss. On a clear October evening, when the red country had gone gold and amber with the season, and the air was sharp with the first cool of fall, Gideon Crawford came to the Finley homestead with a specific purpose. He had thought carefully about how to do this. He was not a man who did things in half measures when it mattered, and this mattered in the largest possible way. He had also thought about Augusta specifically, what she would want, what would be true to who they were, what would feel right in the place and the life they actually inhabited. He did not bring flowers, though he considered it. He did not bring a ring immediately, because he had written to a jeweler in Santa Fe, and the ring he had commissioned was not yet ready, and he had decided after some internal deliberation that the ring was secondary to the question, and the question could not wait another 3 weeks. He came at the end of the day when the light was low and extraordinary, the way it gets in New Mexico in autumn, slanted and golden through the cottonwoods, and he found Augusta on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the evening come in. Thomas was inside. He had made sure of that too, in the careful logistical way he approached things. He sat in the other chair on the porch and they talked for a while about ordinary things in the comfortable way they now talked, which was the easy fluency of two people who had stopped needing to fill silences with effort. Then he set his coffee down and turned to look at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. She already knew. He could see it in her face. She was doing the same thing he was doing, which was feeling the weight of it and letting it be full. "I have thought about how to say this, and I think the honest way is the best way," he said. "I love you, Augusta. I have loved you since you walked out of that store with your chin up and the audacity of what you had just done still in your eyes. I love the way you think, and the way you fight for what is yours, and the way you are with Thomas, and the way you have never once asked me for something you were not willing to pay for, and the way you laugh when you actually laugh. I love who you are completely, and I would like to spend my life with you if you will have me." She was quiet for a moment. The evening light was in her hair. The cottonwoods were gold, and the air smelled of fall grass and wood smoke from the chimney. "Yes," she said, not after a long deliberation but immediately and fully, the way she made all her decisions when she had already done the thinking. "Yes, Gideon, I will." He leaned forward and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with the size of his hands and the working roughness of them. And he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the evening went on around them in its beautiful, ordinary way. Thomas appeared at the door approximately 2 minutes later because he was 5 and patience was not yet his strong suit, and looked at them with an expression that suggested he had understood more of the situation than they had given him credit for. "Are you going to live here now?" he asked Gideon with directness. "If your mother agrees to it," Gideon said. "I agree to it," Augusta said. Thomas considered this. "Can we get another dog?" Augusta put her hand over her mouth. Gideon looked at Thomas with great seriousness. "I have a cattle dog," he said. "Her name is Bee. She would come with me." Thomas's face underwent a transformation of pure joy. A real cattle dog, a real cattle dog. The logistics of what came next required some working out, as all real things do. They agreed on a spring wedding, which gave them the winter to make arrangements. The question of which property they would make their primary residence was discussed practically. Gideon's house was larger, his operation was more established, but Augusta's homestead was her own, hers and Thomas's, and the thing she had fought for, and she would not simply leave it. The solution they arrived at was characteristically practical and their own. They would keep both properties running, with Gideon's as the main residence, but Augusta's homestead would be operated as a second base, with hands managed between the two, the Section 14 grazing land as a shared resource, and the two operations formally combined into a single enterprise with both their names on the deed. Augusta insisted on this last point with a specificity that made Gideon look at her with an expression that was equal parts amused and deeply admiring. "Both names," she said, "on the deed. I am not disappearing into your ledger." "I would not want you to," he said. "Both names." Harris Beaumont in Santa Fe was duly commissioned to draw up the legal particulars of this arrangement, and his response letter was professionally thorough and contained, at the very end, a single sentence. "I am glad for you, Mrs. Finley," which she took in the spirit it was offered. The winter was the best winter Augusta could remember in years. Not because it was easy. Winters in the territory never were, and there were hard weeks of cold and cattle work, and the ordinary struggles of keeping a homestead alive through the lean months. But it was warm in the ways that mattered. She and Gideon spent most evenings together, at one property or the other, and the education of Thomas into the expanded life of his family proceeded with a cheerful informality. Alejandro, who had 3 children of his own and a wife named Carmen, who was one of those people whose warmth is like weather you move through gratefully, became a fixture in their combined lives. Carmen and Augusta became friends with the genuine ease of 2 women who recognized each other. Gideon's cattle dog Bee arrived at the Finley homestead for the first time on a cold December afternoon, and was received by Thomas with a reverence that bordered on religious. Bee, a lean blue heeler with intelligent eyes, assessed Thomas for approximately 30 seconds and then committed to him completely, which Gideon noted was Bee's way. She chose her people quickly and then held to them with absolute loyalty. He thought this showed good judgment. The ring came from Santa Fe in January, a simple band with a small amber stone, the color of New Mexico desert light in the late afternoon. He had described that to the jeweler in his letter as best he could, knowing it would either come out right or not. It came out right. He gave it to her on a January evening by the fire with Thomas asleep and the winter quiet outside, and she put it on and looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then looked at him with eyes that said everything. Ezra Polk, when informed of the engagement, clasped Gideon's hand and said he could not think of a better man for the purpose, and his wife brought a jar of preserved peaches to Augusta with a note that said only, "You deserve good things." Augusta read the note twice and tucked it into the box where she kept important papers. The wedding was held in late April, on a Saturday that the weather provided with unusual generosity, clear and warm with a breeze from the west, and the spring wildflowers already blooming along the creek. They were married in the small church in Calico Flats by a minister named Reverend Abernathy, who kept the ceremony honest and relatively brief, which both of them had specifically requested. Eliza and George Fletcher were there. Alejandro and Carmen and their children were there. Ezra Polk and his family were there. Several ranchers from the surrounding territory, whom Gideon had dealt with honestly over 3 years, came. Harris Beaumont had made the trip from Santa Fe, which Augusta had not expected and which moved her considerably. Even Purvis Dodd from the land office appeared, standing near the back with an expression that suggested he felt personally invested in the outcome of events he had set in motion by accepting her filing. Thomas walked with Augusta to the front of the church and stood beside her with enormous dignity until the minister asked who was presenting this woman, at which point Thomas said, "I am," with such seriousness that several of the women in attendance found it necessary to address their handkerchiefs. Gideon's vows were simple and his. He looked at her and said he promised to stand beside her in everything they faced, to honor what she had built and what she would build, to love her and their son, and whatever came after with all the honesty he possessed, for all his life. His voice was very steady until the very end, when it was not quite steady, which she would tell him later was the part she loved best. Augusta's vows were equally simple and equally her own. She had thought about them for weeks and had tried several drafts and finally set aside the drafts and said what was true, that she had thought she knew what she needed to survive and thrive, and she had been right about most of it. And then she had met him and discovered that what she had needed was also someone to stand next to in the wide open territory of a life, and she was grateful beyond expression that he had shown up in a general store on a Saturday morning and listened. The minister pronounced them married. Gideon kissed his wife. Thomas, standing between them, said, "Finally," with the emphatic relief of a small person who has been very patient and feels this should be acknowledged. The assembled company laughed and then celebrated, because there was genuine cause for celebration in what this day meant, and everyone present understood it. The spring became summer, and summer became the first full season of a combined operation, and the work of two ranches run as one revealed itself to be, in the best possible way, more than the sum of its parts. Section 14 carried 200 head that summer, Augusta's herd and a portion of Gideon's, and the grass proved as good as Robert had always said it would be. Gideon's 4 hands and 2 additional men they hired in the spring managed the combined cattle work with an efficiency that showed in the fall numbers. Harlan Voss, who was aging and whose health was reportedly not good, consolidated his remaining operations and retreated from the southern range entirely that summer. He was still a powerful man, but he was a powerful man who had been publicly checked, and something about that public check seemed to have altered the calculus of his appetite for expansion. The territory around Calico Flats breathed slightly easier. Thomas turned 6 in the summer and was given by his stepfather, a small and very gentle pony of his own, gray with a white blaze, which Thomas named Captain with tremendous solemnity. The sight of Thomas on Captain in the summer mornings, riding beside Gideon on his big bay horse, was one of those images that Augusta stored in the private treasury of moments she returned to when she needed to remember what all of it had been for. In the fall, she told Gideon she was expecting. They were in the kitchen after supper, the lamp lit, the evening coming down outside. He was reading and she was mending, and Thomas was in his room with his journal, and she said it in the straightforward way she said things, looking up from her mending. He put down his book. He looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, which was the specific unguarded wonder of a person receiving something they had not allowed themselves to fully want for fear of wanting it too much. "Augusta," he said. "Yes," she said, with a smile she could not contain. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands and held them, and did not say anything for a long moment because he did not have words immediately available. "Are you well?" he said. "How do you feel?" "I feel well," she said. "I am very well." He kissed her hands. He kissed her face. She laughed and held him, and they stayed like that for a while in the lamplight. Thomas was informed the following morning and received the news with a considered response that aged him approximately 30 years. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We do not know yet," Augusta said. Thomas thought about this. "I think a boy would be better," he said. "I know what to do with a boy." He paused. "But I could probably manage a girl." His magnanimity was noted and appreciated. The winter was full and good, and the spring was better. Augusta carried the pregnancy without serious difficulty, which she attributed to the good food and the good life, and the particular peace of knowing that the land beneath her was hers, and the man beside her was real. The baby came in May, a boy, in the way of a vigorous child who has every intention of making his presence felt immediately. They named him Samuel Robert Crawford, Samuel for Gideon's father and Robert for Augusta's husband, which was right, and which Gideon had suggested himself, which had made Augusta look at him with love so clear it needed no translation. Thomas examined his brother with the intensity of a naturalist studying a new specimen. "He is very small," he reported. "You were also very small," Augusta said. "I do not remember that," Thomas said. "That is the nature of it," Gideon told him. The summer that followed was the fullest they had yet had. 2 properties running well, Section 14 green and productive, Thomas on his pony and Samuel in his cradle, and then, with alarming speed, Samuel pulling himself toward everything interesting and unstable in the household, while B the cattle dog appointed herself his guardian and followed him with maternal attentiveness. Alejandro's wife Carmen came regularly, and the 2 women had the particular friendship of people who have built something in hard country and understand each other's lives fully. Augusta's sister from Kansas came for 2 weeks in August and was overwhelmed by the beauty of it, the light and the vast sky and the red country, and went home promising to return, which Augusta believed she would. There was a morning in September Thomas home from the small school in Calico Flats, Samuel asleep in his cradle, Gideon out checking the north fence with Alejandro. The house quiet in the middle afternoon way it sometimes went quiet, when Augusta sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked at the room around her. At the books on the shelf and the clock that still ran and the framed photograph of herself and Robert that she had moved to the bedroom shelf, where it belonged, in the private and honored place of something precious and finished, not erased but completed. And she looked at the amber ring on her left hand and the new framed photograph on the sitting room wall of herself and Gideon and Thomas on their wedding day, all of them slightly squinting against the April sun and Thomas wearing the expression of someone who has accomplished something. She thought about all of it, the land office, the documents on the counter. The morning Sutter had come to her gate. The drive across 7 miles of open territory. The review and the documents and Caldwell's pinched nose and Voss's lawyer, and the day the decision came and she had let herself cry at the kitchen table with the relief of something finally solid beneath her feet. And she thought about a man in a general store who had stopped at the door and turned around and spoken to her eyes. She thought about what he had said in the store, that what she had done took something. And what he had said on the day of the review, that she was the bravest person he had seen in a long time. She had known even then, even before she let herself know it, that he had not said it to flatter her or manage her or put her in a comfortable category. He had said it the way a person says something that is simply true and needs saying. She had learned, over these months of real and ordinary life with him, that this was how he loved her. Not with performance or declaration, but with consistency, with the repaired fence hinge and the Santa Fe jeweler, and the ring with the amber stone and the supper wine, and the journal for Thomas and the 100 small attentions of a person who sees clearly and acts on what they see, with the name on the deed, with the steadiness of someone who had said he would stand beside her and then simply done so in every circumstance the territory had provided, which had not been a small number. She heard his horse in the yard. She heard him tell Alejandro something about the north fence and thank him. She heard his boots on the porch steps. The door opened. He came in and took his hat off and looked at her at the table and said, "Is the boy still sleeping?" "He is," she said. "Come sit with me for a minute." He came and sat, and she poured him the coffee she had already poured in the manner of a person who had known he was coming in at this time, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her with the look he had, which was the unhurried, attentive look of a man who is entirely where he is. "I was thinking about the store," she said. "The day we met. Saturday morning," he said. "You were telling Eliza about Sutter's visit. You said what I had done was brave," she said. "I did," he said. He was watching her with the quiet understanding that he was following her somewhere. "You meant it as a proposal," she said. "Not a question, an observation." He considered it. "I meant it as the beginning of one," he said. "I did not know that yet, but I think it was." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the amber ring on her hand, and the sound of their son breathing in the next room, and the light of a September afternoon in New Mexico falling through the east window, and she thought that the specific shape of her life, all the loss and the hardness and the 6-week window and the paperwork and the cattle on Section 14, and this man and this morning was so particular and so improbable and so entirely hers that she had no adequate way to hold it except to simply live it. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said, as simply and as fully. Outside, Thomas was somewhere in the yard with Captain, talking seriously to the pony about something Thomas considered important. Bee was lying in a patch of afternoon sun on the porch. Section 14 carried their cattle through the last good grass of the season. The land that was theirs, hers and his and Thomas's and Samuel's, lay open and real and solid in every direction under the enormous New Mexico sky. 2 years later, Thomas Crawford, he had asked, with characteristic solemnity, whether he could use the name, and had been told yes with a joy that made the asking almost unbearable in its sweetness, was 10 years old, and was beginning to know the land the way it needed to be known, the way his mother knew it and his stepfather knew it, from horseback and from work and from long watching. Samuel Crawford was 2.5 and was chiefly concerned with following his brother everywhere, which Thomas bore with the resigned affection of someone who had been told repeatedly that this was an honor and had begun to believe it. The operation they had built ran nearly 3,000 acres between the two properties, employed 6 hands year-round, and was recognized in the county as one of the sound and steady enterprises of the Calico Flats territory. Gideon's reputation for honest dealing and Augusta's reputation for knowing the law and using it had together made them the kind of presence that the territory's better instincts pointed toward as an example. Harris Beaumont had come to visit twice since the wedding and had become a genuine friend, a young man making his way in territorial law who had found in his work with Augusta a sense of what the law could do when wielded for the right purposes. He was engaged to a woman in Santa Fe and had written Augusta a letter asking if she had any wisdom on how to make a life in the territory with a person you loved, which made Augusta smile and write him 3 pages. Eliza Fletcher had told her once, in the warm way that Eliza told things, that the whole town had noticed the change in the place after the land office filing, not in some grand political sense, but in the small daily sense that when someone like Augusta Finley wins something she was right to win, it changes what people believe is possible. Ezra Polk had filed his own formal permit claim on 2 sections adjacent to his homestead the following year, citing the process Augusta had used. He had won them. On a Tuesday evening in October, when the cottonwoods along the creek were gold and the air was turning, and the supper dishes were cleared, and Thomas was at the table with his schoolbooks, and Samuel was asleep, Gideon stood on the porch looking out at the darkening eastern sky, and Augusta came out and stood beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. The land was quiet. The cattle on Section 14 were shapes in the dusk. The sky had gone from orange to purple and the first stars were coming. "I want to expand the herd next season," she said. "I have been thinking about the southwestern corner of Section 14. There is water access there we have not been using." "I noticed that last month," he said. "I thought you might bring it up." "We think alike," she said. "Occasionally," he agreed, and she could hear the smile in it. She lifted her head and looked at him. In the evening light his face was the face she knew completely now, the patience worn into the bone, the laugh that came slow and was worth waiting for, the eyes that saw things clearly and honestly and had seen her clearly and honestly from the very first. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. He understood immediately, because he always understood her immediately, and the expression on his face was the same one she had seen 2.5 years ago in the lamplight of the kitchen, that unguarded wonder. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He pulled her close with a soundlessness that was his particular form of feeling things deeply, and she felt his arms around her and the warmth of him and the solidity of everything they had made and were still making, and she closed her eyes against his chest and listened to the night. Inside the house, Thomas's pencil scratched across his schoolbook page. Samuel breathed in his sleep. Bee's tail thumped once against the porch boards. The stars came out over Section 14, over the Finley Crawford land that was hers and his, and would be their children's, over the red country that asked everything and gave back what you earned, over the territory that was still wild and still becoming and still full of the particular beauty of hard things done right. Augusta Crawford Finley first, as she had always been, stood in the evening with her husband's arms around her, and the life she had built solid beneath her feet, and she was at peace in the deepest way that peace arrives, not as the absence of difficulty, but as the presence of everything that matters, gathered and whole and finally, truly home.